everyone. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Sickle Cell, the Sickle Cell podcast straight out of the UK, raising awareness for sickle cell and discussing the ongoing issues that we have to deal with every single day. I'm your host, Jenica, and as we continue to bring you these very important conversations, I would love to get some feedback on what your thoughts are on this podcast, and also to get to know some of our listeners. So you can engage with us on social media. We are at Sickle Cell Podcast on TikTok and on Instagram. So check out our posts, share our posts, send us messages, and also share this podcast within your circles. You know, sickle cell is a very important topic, and it's a disease that everyone should know about, especially considering it's the most common and fastest growing in the world. So without further ado, let's get into today's conversation. So Michael and I spoke with MP Jess Phillips. Jess Phillips is the Labour MP for Birmingham Yardley and Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding. And when we spoke to Jess Phillips, which was back in 2022, she was also an officer of the Sickle Cell and Thalassemia APPG. And before we start this episode, I would just like to let our listeners know again that Michael's voice will be heard in this episode. Hello, Jess Phillips. Let's talk about sickle cell. Michael, take it away.
First of all, welcome to the Sickle Cell podcast. We're obviously trying to raise awareness for issues pertaining to sickle cell and sickle cell warriors. And particular episode, we're going to focus on Black women who have the condition. You've obviously spent quite a lot of time on the parliamentary report, which came out in November. Yep. So the issues that we want to speak about in this episode, obviously concerning women and also concerning violence against women, brings me to my first question. A number of studies, both sides of the Atlantic, have revealed that Black women, particularly pregnant Black women, are still up to 40% less likely to be administered pain medication, analgesia, in hospital. Now, as a campaigner against various forms of violence that are afforded against women, can that be construed as a form of violence in itself?
100% it should be construed as a form of violence. I mean, in the round, with regard, certainly when you're talking about maternity services in their whole, all women, there is definitely a dangerous element that women are meant to tolerate pain in a way that we wouldn't with any other form of medical procedure, like giving birth. There wouldn't be a virtue of like having your teeth pulled out, for example, without pain relief, and a sort of culture of that virtue. And there is an element, and it's similar with other women's health issues, whether that's endometriosis, whether they're older women faced with the menopause. There has been this sort of, well, women just cope with this stuff sort of thing. That has always been the case. That has seen under research and under medicalized nature of the health things that affect women. And unfortunately, the way that manifests for women is pain. It is literally to feel physical pain, and that is totally tolerable, that they might feel physical pain. Now, if you layer onto that the dreadful, and frankly, I cannot believe it hasn't, I mean, actually, I totally can believe, but it is shocking to feel that it hasn't progressed at all. The status of, for example, infant mortality and maternal mortality in cases of Black women in the UK. If you look at those two things together, you have got to either see some form of institutional racism, but also the sort of enhanced element that these are women we feel there has been a systematic feeling of tolerance of their pain and intolerance of their complaint. So the combination that we can tolerate as a society, these women feeling pain, at the same time as if they complain about it, we become totally intolerant, sort of angry Black women syndrome. Those two things together lead to dangerous outcomes without question.
I don't need to remind you that Black women in particular provide the bedrock of support for the Labour Party in England and Democrats in America. But there's still a feeling within the Black community that for all this unwavering loyalty, we're still not getting enough back. Do you think you're taking these votes for granted?
I mean, I think almost every single community that is loyal to a political party both feels and is and can be taken for granted by that political party. whether that's a safe seat in Northern England where that was an ex-mining town, can get the feeling that their loyalty is not rewarded, right down to, I mean, in my community, I represent largely sort of Muslim, Bangladeshi, Kashmiri, Pakistani group of people in my constituency, the biggest sort of diversity element of it. And, I have absolutely no doubt that there are elements of, would be absolutely true to say, and I say this with no worry about how, it gets me in trouble, is that if you have a safe seat, you are much less likely to be, for want of a better word, chasing the votes as if you have a marginal seat. That is just a blatant reality of the fact. It's why I don't particularly like safe seats. I don't particularly like sort of single community politics. It's like, we all vote this way. I'm from Irish immigrant background, and similarly, it was just like, well, we remember the 1950s, and so we vote Labour. We know that. I mean, Enoch Powell's from my constituency, for goodness sake. So is Malala Yousafzai. So I feel like we've got a balance. But, I don't like the idea that any one political grouping represents any one group of people. I think it is bad for those people. I think it's bad for the politics that it breeds. And so, I have no doubt that, it's not for me to say how the Black community feel. It's for you and other members of the Black community to tell me how you feel. And actually, if it's not being served, what are the things? Now, obviously, not all Black people are the same, and they don't want all the same things, just like any other group of people. But what is the thing, can be delivered? We're never going to get everything right. No two ways about that. And anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to you. But what are the things that we should be doing more of?
That brings me next then to the all-party report that you were part of for sickle cell. Now, the resentment, I think, amongst sickle cell sufferers is quite apparent in the sense that this has been going on for generations, that they've been dealing with this, but it took until 2021. Now, can you understand what, people that were born perhaps in the 60s and 70s like I was feel about that? That's how long it's taken, that they've seen relatives die of this illness and suffer through the health system in a brutal way at times. That sickle cell patients have been treated, that it's taken until 2021 for the first report. Now, there are a lot of people, families that I've spoken to leading up to that are still angry, like Evan Smith, who was denied oxygen in A&E, Richard Okoregi, who found face down in a puddle, and his mother still doesn't know what the last moments of his life is like, as it's quite plausible that you will be in power in 2024. What's going to be at the top of your list?
For me, the fundamental of inequality is the reason that I got involved in healthcare. And funnily enough, actually, the first time I ever properly was appalled by inequality in the place where I live was in the sort of late 1990s, early 2000s, when my mum was doing a piece of work. She was a civil servant in the Department of Health, around the infant mortality rate in Birmingham, that showed all the things that are still, that's why I'm like, why has nothing progressed? So health inequalities to me, and the anger that you're describing, I think that going back to what I started to say about the similar anger I feel about how women's health has been just completely and utterly ignored as a factor, I totally understand how it feels as if you cannot make any progress, no matter how many people die. Every year I stand up and read out the names of women who've been murdered, for example. Every year that list gets longer. You stop being hopeful and you start to just be enraged, and then you're considered to be unhelpful, and then the cycle continues. The thing about sickle cell that I find, and this is not to defend Margaret Thatcher in any sense, but it felt like it was an issue I heard so much more about when I was a kid. So I was a kid in the 1980s, and I don't know whether it was just the sort of age of that particular migrant population at the time and level of activism where I lived. The part of Birmingham that I come from at that time was far more white and black people as opposed to the makeup of it now. And so that may be a reason. But there were like 3 kids in my class who had sickle cell when I was a kid at primary school in Birmingham. And we knew about it in order to care for them. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, if Leon's poorly, like, call a teacher sort of thing. Like, you know, you got to watch out for Leon. Leon was my best friend. I remember so much. He taught me how to cartwheel. But I felt like it was much more in the public consciousness when I was a kid. And I don't know whether that's just because of my own personal exposure to it. And then I felt like there's been an enormous waning of that knowledge and just people talking about it. There seemed to be a big dip in that. I'm not learned enough to explain why that might have been or what was the process for that happening until this report was in front of me. And in fact, the reason I got involved in the sickle cell and thalassemia, as it is, the APPG on sickle cell and thalassemia, is my sister-in-law has thalassemia, my nephews have thalassemia, they are of Iranian heritage. And so I was like, and I noticed how her maternity care with beta thalassemia was not good enough, essentially. And I was like, oh, hang on, I know that this is bad for women with this condition. I'm going to get re-involved. And I was absolutely stunned, actually, even in a place like Birmingham, where you would expect in these regional centres where you're going to be seeing cases of sickle cell. In a place like Birmingham, it is not, it should be totally mainstream as a condition of concern that has a pathway. I was really, really shocked to find that sort of standard hemoglobinopathy. I was stunned at how little progress had been made. And so for me, it is about health inequalities across the board. It is about how Black people and women get treated in mental health services completely differently to standard services. It would be about making sure that really standard things in their lives, like to the Black community, people with sickle cell, it's a standard thing. To women, the menopause is going to happen to us all. It's not even like some of us won't get it. The only alternative is death. So we're all gonna get it. And like these standard things have got to be the default of all of our services, whether it's justice, whether it's education. At the moment, is the experience of a wealthy white man, because they were the ones who built them and designed them. I mean, the whole justice system was designed by men for men, and you can feel it if you have to go through it. And so we've got to have a massive overhaul of what we consider to be the default experience of a UK individual, and how we build standardized services, let alone niche clinics for things, or your women's health centre, your sickle cell pathways. We've got to reconsider what is the standard experience of a member of the UK population.
You mentioned a few things there. So I mean, firstly, as a topic of the podcast is about, young Black women, well, not young, but Black women living with sickle cell. I'm a Black woman, I live with sickle cell, and I also live in Birmingham, where you are an MP. It was interesting what you said about the fact that when you were growing up in Birmingham, you were aware of those that were around you that had sickle cell, but then you suddenly noticed that there was almost somewhat of a silence. And a lack of voices and a lack of people speaking about it. And I almost feel like I can relate to that as well, as, growing up in Birmingham and at one point seeing very much like, people that were older than me advocating for sickle cell, and that suddenly, being a thing of the past. Like currently in Birmingham, I don't feel like there are a lot of advocates specifically in Birmingham. And I personally feel like that could be because everyone I knew that was that age group, when they were growing up, they had the same energy as me. They've been doing the work, they've been vocalizing it, but nothing happened. So therefore, suddenly we're not seeing and hearing anything, because it becomes like almost tiring and you feel like nothing's going to change. But now we have this report and, it was encouraged or say motivated by the death of a young man, which should never have been the case. Not to mention the fact that there's been a lack of research and no kind of treatments or medication for sickle cell in over 2 decades. Do you think now that we've got this report and all the things that I just mentioned, as well as the fact that there's now a new generation of people living with sickle cell advocating for it and speaking about it, and with the APPG in place, do you think you guys will be able to work more towards keeping this conversation active and not letting it die out like it did in the past?
Yeah, look, I think that the APPG report, I was really pleased on the day that it was released. And at the moment, I mean, this is no mean feat at the moment. to catch a news cycle where you can be heard in a time of COVID-19 and endless people having endless parties. There seemed to be a moment of lull at the point that the report was released, and it was, I was driving into work and listening to them talking about it on the radio. I was really, really pleased. And Pat McFadden, who is the chair of that group, is absolutely, he's just my friend, so I'm dreadfully biased, but, he's absolutely determined to ensure that the recommendations and the demands of the report are met. But from what you're saying, I understand totally how people get, like, we tried and failed. And, that's what, it seems easy to say, well, just keep going. But if you tried and failed for 20 years, you start to just think, what's the point? I'm never going to get anywhere. No one's ever going to listen. And it's considered to be like a nice little niche thing. And the thing for me, that as well as all the individual recommendations in the report around pathways and training and all of those things, as well as all of those individual recommendations, I know from the campaigning work that I do around women's rights that individualized recommendations are where you end up, and you end up as activists feeling just grateful when somebody says, we're going to do a review. All that means is they're going to write down the thing you already know onto a piece of paper. Just FYI, that means absolutely nothing. And I find myself going, yes, the government's agreed to a review. You get this sort of gratitude and fatigue in a hierarchy where you'll allow for small gains to be the victory. And that's, you need that as activists to keep you going. You do need to feel the wins and have targets and timelines. But to me, it has got to be, what needs to be pushed is an entire overhaul, a revolution, if you will, within the system, as I'm saying, of what is the default position and who are we serving? Lest we forget, in the case of when I was a kid, and Leon was in my class and we were talking about this, if I'd gone into a hospital in Birmingham, the vast majority of the staff would have been people of Caribbean descent as well. Never ever let it be forgotten that our entire healthcare system, whilst ignoring the experiences of Black people, could not survive without them and could not have been built without them. The reality is that it cannot just keep taking it for granted as labour, the default labour, but not the default experience. And that, it seems to me, to be the most, I'm loath to say, if I was in power, the first 10 days I would do this, because I would just be essentially bullshitting you the way that the government bullshits me and says, we'll give £5 million as this refuge over here. And it'd be like, that's going to help like 100 women in 5 years, and there's 5 million every year. Like, cheers. So we have to be really, really careful as we campaign for change, that we take the small wins as wind in our sails and push for them without question. You're more likely to achieve those, certainly from a point of view of opposition. But to never take your eye off the prize of being the default member of society that we deserve to be.
Again, in your position on the Labour front bench, would you like to see a support network for Black women with sickle cell who've been incarcerated?
My views on women's incarceration, I cannot be clearer that in almost every single case of women incarcerated in our country, it would be better for them not to be incarcerated. Full stop. I used to run a female offenders service that diverted women from prisons because it's simply an ill on society, actually, removing children from women, removing their housing from them, to put them in prison for 3 weeks for an acquisitive crime that they, in many cases, the pathway for them to have perpetrated that crime was due to violences and abuses and exploitations, both wealth exploitations and direct sexual exploitations that they may have suffered. Absolutely, improving. I cannot sit through another report of a woman whose baby has died in prison, or a dead woman in prison, and see what crime this person committed and know that it wasn't safer for the streets for her to be in there. It's unfathomable to me that you would have a population of Black women incarcerated and not have a specific sickle cell policy in incarceration. That beggars belief.
One of the things that I think is brilliant is that the APPG is made up of a lot of MPs from different constituencies. So, I'm someone that lives in Birmingham, which I would consider to be the second city. And of course, we have Pat McFadden as the chair, who's Wolverhampton. We have you as an officer for Birmingham and Yardley. Now, Birmingham has the second highest prevalence of people living with sickle cell. London has the actual highest. And because of that, there's clearly a postcode when it comes to the level of care. And I would even go as far as to say accessing care as well. So I think one of the things that could be done, and having you guys there may help this as well, is having someone responsible for making sure that all of the things that will be reviewed as a result of the report and all of the new guidelines that will be put in place, ensuring that all of these changes are actually being filtered through to the outer regions and not just, staying in London, because everything just seems to be focused in London.
I mean, I hear you on that, sister, about literally everything. I feel that way about literally everything. Everything seems to focus on London. It's a constant bugbear, but you're absolutely right. So it's about, in that case, it is about using the report and us meeting, not just with the people in London. Although bear in mind that the current health secretary is the Member of Parliament for Bromsgrove, which is only 2 constituencies along from me, interestingly enough. So he should be seeing this too. To be fair to him, I don't think he's without care on such matters, if I had to be fair to him. But in fact, I'm speaking to one of his special advisors today, so I shall mention it. I shall say, can you make sure that the report is across his desk and that he's looking at the recommendations? But it's about looking at how we get our influencers here, so our health trust managers and things, to be pushing for this. And at the moment, unfortunately, in a health environment at the moment, you're trying to get traction in a tidal wave where, I mean, in my constituency, if you call an ambulance at the moment, you'll be waiting 8 hours, regardless of if you've had a heart attack. Like, this is the health services on its knees at the moment, and they are fighting for new buildings, new capacity. There aren't enough GP places. And so one has to be careful that it doesn't get lost in what is currently a calamitous situation within our NHS, both because of a generation of cuts, but also and a generation of lack of planning. But, without question, the pandemic will have exacerbated that. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I will make sure that myself and Pat, certainly, for being from this region, and Sajid, I'll invite him, he's from the region. I will make sure that we are pushing our local teams as much as we are to be pushing the national team.
Okay, well, very quickly, the 2 things that I think that could be changed, first of all, is that the best doctors I've ever come across in my lifetime are the doctors that listen to their patients. And rather than imposing certain pain regimes on sickle cell patients that they're not happy with. And that's been the biggest single issue that I've seen. And the second thing that I think that's been good is that in St George's Hospital in London, they had a fast tracking policy, whereas when sickle cell patients went to A&E, they were fast tracked. I'd been given pain relief by a sickle cell nurse within 30 minutes of arriving at A&E. And the bed, it was a brilliant policy, but they ran out of money and she got pushed off. And she was brilliant. I mean, we're literally relying on individual nurses, because that particular nurse would go up to a doctor and say, sign this, I want to give a patient pain medication. And she would literally stand there until the doctor signed it so she could give them a pain relief. And so at least they were comfortable before they saw their junior doctor, because it's a junior doctor and a normal process. So that fast tracking policy, which they had at a few London hospitals, I think is now gone because of the COVID, and B, because they don't have the money and the care. But it was working. That was the frustration. It was working.
Be wary of a pilot, as I say. Always be wary of a pilot, of a short-termist solution. It has to be a maintenance phase. It has to be that these things aren't nice to haves in times of plenty. They have to be the default position based on a needs assessment of the area you are representing. Now, I'm not going to say that they're going to need one of those nurses in Devon and Cornwall. Like, nobody is suggesting that is the case, but it should be the default position of any hospital. What I would say about Devon and Cornwall is that every A&E has domestic abuse victims, and yet there are 4 hospitals in the entire country that have specialist nurses trained in domestic violence like that. So once again, we are just not the default position. And so I think that you're absolutely right. So much hinges on decent personnel. There is no system in the world, thank goodness, because otherwise we're all going to be replaced by robots, that replaces the fact that you get a good person doing a good thing, and they are worth their absolute weight in gold. And the next person, or on the shift change, and that's the thing that happens in hospitals. Anyone who's given birth for a longer period than 8 hours knows the difference of a shift change. It's just like, this was lovely. Oh no, this is terrifying. Oh, it's lovely again. Oh, I'm the same person going through the same thing, and the personnel changing around me has ruined this situation or made it brilliant. You can't necessarily train that out of the system, but you can demand specialism at all times on a shift-based rota without question. So your nurse in that you're talking about, and that is certainly. But like I say, at the moment, it's just considered the nice to have. Pain of Black people with sickle cell, pain of women coming in is just, wouldn't it be lovely if we could have that? Imagine if they said the same about diabetes. That's always my argument about DV, is the epidemic of domestic violence is to the Home Office what diabetes is to the NHS. It is a populous epidemic. It is everywhere, every single social class, every different diversity issue. It is everywhere. Now imagine if we said to people with diabetes that only 1 in 4 of them was entitled to have insulin, and the other 3 and 4 can have the insulin, and not even the good insulin, the watered down insulin that they could find in the bottom of a drawer at the point minutes before they were going to die.
Yeah. Well, there's just one final, very, very quick I would also make, is that do you feel it's time there was more visible representation to profile these issues, both from within your party and the media? Because one thing that, again, the sickle cell community is angry about, that the BBC has a charter. Now, in 100 years, they have never, ever, not one time, commissioned a documentary series profiling sickle cell anemia. Never, ever, ever. No UK has ever done that. None at all. 19 production companies have approached the BBC, and they've all been turned down. They've all been declined. All of them, every single one. And there's a real anger amongst production companies and sickle cell people that there's never been one, not one, ever. There's been news pieces at 20 minutes here and 20 minutes there, but there's never been one documentary ever on the BBC, despite its charter, on sickle cell anemia. And there is a real anger about that.
Yeah, I find that flabbergasting, if I'm honest. And actually, in my campaigns, often the jumping off point for government action is based on really well done documentaries. So if you think of abuse in care homes that was occurring, if you think of some of the stuff around detention, like the government only acts when the public's interest is piqued by good storytelling. And as our national service broadcast provider, I'm happy to write to them and ask them why not. I mean, I'm constantly writing to them about something or another. I think they think I'm the commissioner of the BBC.
I mean, when you actually think about it and, you hear all of these things, it's absolutely horrific. It's horrific, the things that we've gone through. But I think, as I do like to try and remain positive, because we can only but hope that something different will come. It's amazing to have voices like your own, Jess Phillips, and, other people that are part of the APPG that are, trying to vocalize what we're going through and trying to make a change. So continue fighting the good fight, and thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about sickle cell. That is all for this week. Remember, you can contact us and reach out on our socials. We have TikTok and Instagram, and it's at Sickle Cell Podcast. I will be back real soon for another episode of Let's Talk About Sickle Cell. Take care.